Across 13 billion light-years of observable universe, John Osterman had witnessed the birth and death of stars, the mathematical certainty of entropy, the crystalline predictability of atomic structures collapsing and reforming in endless cycles. He had grown bored with his own dimension's simplicity, its linear causality, its single timeline stretching forward like a thread pulled taut. So he had reached through the quantum foam between realities, feeling for something different. He found it. The Koprulu sector existed in a state of perpetual violence that fascinated him. 3 civilizations locked in existential warfare, each representing a distinct approach to survival. Biological adaptation, technological dominance, and psionic unity. The mathematical complexity of their conflict created probability cascades that even his perception of simultaneous time struggled to fully calculate. So Dr. Manhattan simply stepped through. The world called Char greeted him with sulfurous atmosphere and volcanic heat that would have vaporized a human body in seconds. John Osterman stood naked on blackened rock, 30 feet tall and glowing with inner atomic light, watching as Terran Marines in CMC-powered armor exchanged Gauss rifle fire with skittering Zerglings a kilometer away. The Marines were losing. They always lost on Char, eventually. The Zerg owned this world, had reshaped it into a living nightmare optimized for their biology. A hydralisk burst from underground directly beneath where Manhattan stood, its spine-launching carapace already contracting to fire. John observed the creature's muscular structure, the hydraulic system that would propel bone spikes at supersonic velocity, the primitive neural ganglia that received instructions from something vast and distant. He reached down with one blue hand and touched the creature's armored head. The hydralisk ceased to exist, not disintegrated, simply unmade at the molecular level, its component atoms scattering into the toxic wind. Across the battlefield, 100 Zerg turned as one toward this new presence. The Terran Marines noticed the sudden shift in enemy attention and fell back, their combat visors struggling to classify the massive blue humanoid that had appeared from nowhere. Emergency channels crackled with confused reports to the Dominion command structure orbiting above Char's volcanic surface. Manhattan stood perfectly still as the Zerg swarm approached. He could see their past, genetic material harvested from thousands of worlds, evolution weaponized and accelerated beyond natural law. He could see their present, individual organisms subordinated entirely to collective will. And he could see their futures, multiple branching possibilities that all converged on a single imperative: consume, adapt, perfect. A wave of Zerglings reached him first, their razor-sharp claws designed to shred through powered armor. They leaped at his massive form in perfect coordination. Manhattan expanded his perception and saw the psionic network connecting them, traced it back through cerebrates and overlords to something immense that lurked in Char's deepest hive clusters, something that was now paying very close attention to him. He raised one hand. The attacking Zerglings froze mid-leap, then began to drift apart molecule by molecule, unraveling into their constituent atoms. 300 organisms reduced to carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and trace elements in less than 2 seconds. The atomic cloud dispersed, raining down as a fine powder that Char's winds caught and scattered. Manhattan tilted his head, examining the sky. Terran wraiths and mutalisks were locked in dogfights through the upper atmosphere, their contrails and acid spray creating patterns of controlled chaos. A Terran battlecruiser hung in low orbit, its Yamato cannon charging as it prepared to glass another section of Char's surface. He could sense communication systems screaming with traffic as both species attempted to understand what had just happened on the battlefield below. But there was something else, a third presence watching from high orbit with sensors far more sophisticated than Terran technology. ships with energy shields and weapons that bent physics itself. The Protoss. They had detected him too. John Osterman stood alone on the battlefield, surrounded by the corpses of Terrans who hadn't retreated fast enough, and Zerg that had thrown themselves uselessly against his perfect invulnerability. He had intended to simply observe this universe's conflicts, to study the mathematical elegance of their three-way war. But he was beginning to understand that his mere presence had already altered too many variables. The Terran Dominion would want to weaponize him, the Zerg would want to consume and assimilate him, and the Protoss, he wasn't certain yet what they would want. In the distance, the ground began to tremble. Something massive was approaching through Char's tunnel networks, something that made the volcanic world itself seem to recoil. Manhattan's perception of time flickered strangely, multiple futures suddenly collapsing into uncertainty. For the first time since his transformation in that intrinsic field chamber decades ago, John Osterman felt something resembling surprise. The Overmind had noticed him, and it was coming. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. The possibilities are endless. Manhattan increased his size to 50 feet, his blue luminescence brightening until it cast shadows across the entire battlefield. He would meet this hive consciousness. He would speak with it, if such a thing was possible, and then he would decide whether this universe's endless war deserved his intervention or his indifference. The ground split open, and the first of the Overmind's Cerebrate extensions emerged into the light. The Cerebrate hauled itself onto Char's surface like a grotesque parody of birth, its massive brain sac pulsing with bioluminescent veins that flickered in rhythm with thoughts too alien for human comprehension. Dozens of sensory tendrils writhed around its base, tasting the air, reading chemical signatures, analyzing the atomic residue where Manhattan had unmade hundreds of Zerg organisms. The creature had no eyes in any conventional sense, but Manhattan could feel its attention focusing on him with an intensity that suggested intelligence far beyond individual consciousness. Behind it, the tunnel erupted with more Zerg, not the mindless swarm of Zerglings, but specialized forms, ultralisks with bladed carapaces capable of shearing through bunker walls, queens that could infest Terran command centers and bend human will to Zerg purposes. And hovering above them all, an overlord whose bloated form served as both transport and psionic relay, connecting this entire force to the vast intelligence that lurked in Char's core. Manhattan experienced the next 10 seconds simultaneously. In one future, he disintegrated the entire force. In another, he teleported away and allowed events to unfold without his interference. In a third, the Cerebrate somehow bridged the gap between their incompatible forms of existence and actual communication occurred. But there was a fourth future, dim, uncertain, obscured by something that interfered with his precognition like static disrupting a signal. The Overmind's voice struck his consciousness like a tsunami of alien thought. We are the swarm. We are perfection through consumption. We are the culmination of 10,000 species evolved beyond limitation. You are impossible. The words weren't spoken. They bypassed language entirely, transmitted through the same psionic network that coordinated every Zerg organism across a dozen star systems. Manhattan's atomic structure resonated with the transmission, his quantum-entangled consciousness receiving and processing the Overmind's attention in ways that would have shattered a human mind. I am Dr. Manhattan, he responded, his voice carrying across normal sound waves that seemed primitive compared to the Overmind's psionic assault. I am quantum observation made manifest. I am uncertainty collapsed into singular purpose. You are outside biological imperative. You are beyond flesh, yet you maintain form. This is intriguing. The Cerebrate's tendrils extended toward Manhattan, and he observed their cellular structure with detached fascination. Each cell contained genetic sequences from hundreds of different species, adaptive enzymes from one, regenerative properties from another, environmental resistance from a third. The Zerg weren't merely a species, they were a living database of every organism they'd ever consumed, every useful trait preserved and optimized through forced evolution. Manhattan allowed one tendril to make contact with his leg. The moment of connection sent a shockwave through the psionic network that made every Zerg organism on Char pause simultaneously. The Cerebrate's entire body convulsed as it attempted to process what it was touching. Matter that existed in superposition, atoms that occupied multiple quantum states at once. A form held together not by biological processes, but by conscious will imposed on physical law itself. You cannot be assimilated. Your essence cannot be consumed. This violates fundamental principles of the swarm. Everything can be assimilated, Manhattan replied, his tone utterly neutral. Given sufficient time and adaptation, but I exist outside time as you understand it. I am experiencing this conversation simultaneously with your inevitable attempts to consume me over the next 100 years. In 93% of those timelines, you fail. The Overmind's response came with such force that the volcanic ground cracked in concentric circles around the Cerebrate. Then we shall explore the 7% where we succeed. The Zerg swarm surged forward, not to attack, but to surround Manhattan's massive form. Ultralisks created a living perimeter, while queens began secreting strange organic compounds that filled the air with complex pheromones. The Overlord descended until it hovered directly above Manhattan's head, and through its connection to the Overmind, he felt something unprecedented. The entire Zerg hive consciousness focusing on him with the intensity it usually reserved for consuming entire civilizations. Manhattan observed genetic sequences being rewritten in real time across the swarm. The Overmind was already adapting, creating new strains optimized not for killing him, that was impossible, but for understanding him. Zerg biology began incorporating new structures, quantum-sensitive organelles, cells designed to detect superposition states, neural clusters that attempted to mirror his non-linear perception of time. It was impressive. In the 17 seconds since contact, the Overmind had evolved further than natural selection would have allowed in 10 million years. The Zerg weren't just adaptable, they were adaptation itself weaponized. But there was a problem. Manhattan could see it in the futures branching out from this moment. The more the Overmind focused on understanding him, the more it diverted resources from its war against the Terrans and Protoss. In orbit above Char, Protoss carriers were already moving into position, their sensors detecting the massive psionic surge below. And the Terran Dominion was scrambling ghost operatives, humans with psionic potential who could interface with Zerg neural patterns. Everyone wanted to know what was happening on Char's surface. Everyone wanted to control or kill this new variable that had appeared in their perfectly balanced apocalypse. Manhattan felt the Overmind attempting something audacious. It was trying to establish a permanent psionic link with him, to add him to the swarm not through biological assimilation, but through mental integration. The attempt was fascinating in its futility. His consciousness existed simultaneously across multiple quantum states. The Overmind's hive mind operated through collective neural networks. They were fundamentally incompatible forms of existence trying to interface. "You cannot add me to your swarm," Manhattan said, pulling his leg away from the Cerebrate's tendril. The organic appendage withered instantly, its cells unable to maintain structure once disconnected from his quantum field. "But I can unmake your swarm entirely. I have done so in 47 of the futures I'm currently observing." "Then, why do you hesitate?" If you possess such power, why have you not already acted? The question made Manhattan pause, a genuine moment of uncertainty that the Overmind detected immediately. Because it was the right question. If he was truly indifferent to this universe's conflicts, why had he come here at all? Why had he chosen to appear on a battlefield rather than empty space? Why did he continue engaging with these violent, desperate civilizations instead of observing from a distance? Before he could formulate an answer, the sky above Char ignited with golden light. Protoss's carriers had begun their attack, their interceptors screaming through the atmosphere in perfect formation. And behind them, something else was descending, a massive construct that bent space-time around its approach. The Protoss had sent an arbiter. They intended to capture this entire section of Char in a stasis field and study what was happening at their leisure. Manhattan looked up at the approaching ships, then back at the Cerebrate, which continued pulsing with the Overmind's attention. "Your question will have to wait," he said. "We have company." The Protoss interceptors broke through Char's toxic cloud layer in a cascade of azure energy trails, their phase disruptor cannons already charging. Manhattan watched their approach with multiple layers of perception, the elegant physics of their propulsion systems, the psionic signatures of their pilots connected through something called the Kala, and the 17 different tactical formations they might employ in the next 90 seconds. But something about the Protoss made his precognition stutter and fragment. Their collective consciousness operated on principles that shouldn't be possible according to his universe's quantum mechanics. The lead carrier unleashed its full complement of interceptors, a swarm of automated fighters that moved with inhuman precision. They weren't targeting Manhattan directly. Instead, they carved through the Zerg perimeter with surgical efficiency. Ultralisks exploded under concentrated fire, their armored carapaces no match for focused energy weapons. The Queens retreated into tunnel networks while the Overlord attempted to gain altitude, its massive form struggling against Char's gravity. Manhattan remained motionless as interceptors screamed past him, their weapons carefully avoiding his position. The Protoss weren't attacking him, they were isolating him. Smart. The Cerebrate's psionic voice filled his mind with urgent intensity. The Firstborn seek to contain you. They will place you beyond reach of the swarm. This cannot be permitted. Your concern is noted but irrelevant, Manhattan replied, watching as the Arbiter descended through the battle like a golden cathedral floating on impossible physics. The vessel's hull was covered in crystalline structures that pulsed with the same energy he'd detected in the Protoss psionic network. I exist outside conventional space. No stasis field can contain me. Then you underestimate Protoss technology. It is not born of physics alone, but of forces they call the Kala, unity of thought made manifest in material reality. The Arbiter reached optimal altitude and its stasis field generators began to glow. Manhattan felt space-time itself beginning to crystallize around the designated area, local causality freezing as the field attempted to lock everything within its radius into a single moment stretched across hours. It was remarkable technology, not quite time manipulation, but close enough to give him genuine pause. He teleported. One moment he stood among dying Zerg. The next he materialized inside the Arbiter's command bridge, his 50-foot form shrinking to normal human size to fit the elegant architecture. Protoss warriors reacted instantly. Zealots ignited psi blades that crackled with golden energy, while a High Templar raised its hands to channel lightning that could vaporize tanks. But they all froze when they actually saw him. The Protoss resembled humanoids only superficially. Digitigrade legs, elongated skulls with glowing eyes, no mouths. They communicated entirely through telepathy, and Manhattan could sense their confusion radiating through the Kala like ripples in disturbed water. They were trying to understand what he was, scanning him with technology and psionic perception simultaneously. A voice entered his mind, more structured than the Overmind's crushing weight, but equally alien. You are not Terran. You are not Zerg. You are not Xel'Naga, though you carry echoes of their handiwork. What manner of being stands before the firstborn? Manhattan turned toward the source, a Protoss wearing elaborate armor marked with symbols that suggested high rank. An executor or judicator, someone with authority to make decisions. The being's psionic presence was immense, but unlike the Overmind's singular crushing will, this felt like a choir of voices harmonized into unity. I am Dr. Manhattan. I come from a universe where consciousness is not shared, but isolated, where each mind experiences reality alone. The Protoss warriors shifted uncomfortably, their emotional responses bleeding through the Kala despite their discipline. The concept of true isolation, of minds unable to touch each other, seemed to disturb them profoundly. Isolation is the path of the Dark Templar, those who severed themselves from our unity. Are you one of the fallen? I am not Protoss, Manhattan replied. I was human once. Then I was scattered across quantum probability and reconstituted myself through conscious will. Now I am what I choose to be. The High Templar stepped forward, its psionic storm still crackling between its raised hands but held in check. Through the Kala, Manhattan sensed an entire debate occurring among the Protoss present. Thousands of thoughts exchanged in the seconds it would take humans to speak a single sentence. They were deciding his fate collectively, weighing threat against opportunity, fear against curiosity. You appeared on Shar during our operation against the Zerg, the Executor communicated. You demonstrated power sufficient to unmake life itself. The Overmind has focused considerable attention upon you. These facts suggest you are either weapon, enemy, or harbinger of something we do not yet understand. All three, Manhattan said, and none of them. I came here to observe your war. I did not intend to become part of it. Intention is irrelevant. You have already altered the balance. The Terran Dominion is mobilizing ghost operatives to investigate you. The Overmind has created new strains of Zerg optimized to study your quantum nature. And we... The Executor paused, its psychic presence flickering with something that might have been doubt. We do not know what you are. This troubles us deeply. Manhattan walked toward the Arbiter's viewing portal, passing through the line of zealots as if they were stationary objects rather than living beings. None of them moved to stop him, partly because they sensed the futility, partly because the Kala was screaming warnings about attacking something that existed outside their understanding of reality. Through the portal, he observed Char's surface. The stasis field had activated despite his departure, freezing the Cerebrate and its escort in temporal suspension. Terran dropships were now descending from the Dominion battlecruiser, Marines and Firebats preparing to secure the area. And somewhere below the volcanic crust, the Overmind was undoubtedly preparing its next move. Your Kala, Manhattan said without turning. It connects all Protoss minds into a unified consciousness. You experience reality as a collective. It is the gift of the Xel'Naga, those who shaped us in ancient times. Through the Kala we know truth, purpose, and unity. We are never alone. I am always alone, Manhattan replied. I perceive the past, present, and future simultaneously. I exist in quantum superposition. My consciousness cannot be shared or divided. Even when I was human, even when Janie held my hand and told me she loved me, I was fundamentally isolated inside my own perception. The Protoss exchanged more thoughts through their shared consciousness, processing this revelation. Finally, the Executor spoke again. Then you are the antithesis of the Kala. You are absolute isolation made manifest. This explains why our precognitive abilities fail to predict your actions. You exist outside the unified consciousness that allows us to glimpse possibility. Your precognition is based on shared probability perception, Manhattan observed. You see futures through collective agreement on what is likely. I see futures through quantum observation of all possible states. We're using fundamentally different mechanisms to achieve similar results. And the Overmind? What does it seek from you? Assimilation, understanding, the same thing you seek. Everyone in this universe wants to know how I work, how to control me, how to replicate me. Manhattan finally turned back to face the Executor. But I am unique. There is no mechanism to copy me, no genetic sequence to harvest, no technology to reverse engineer. I am a singular event, quantum probability collapsed into impossible configuration. The High Templar lowered its hands, the psionic storm dissipating. Through the Kala, it communicated directly with Manhattan's mind. Then you are alone in ways we cannot fathom. The Kala binds all Protoss. The Overmind unifies all Zerg. Even the Terrans cluster together in their cities and ships, seeking companionship. But you, I require nothing from anyone, Manhattan finished. I exist complete unto myself. A terrible burden, the Executor replied. To experience all time at once, to possess power without limit, yet to remain forever isolated within your own consciousness. We do not envy you, Blue One. For the first time since arriving in the Koprulu sector, Manhattan felt something unexpected, the faint echo of an emotion he'd thought long dead. Not quite sympathy, not quite connection, but a recognition that these beings, so alien in form and thought, had identified something about his existence that he'd stopped acknowledging centuries ago. He was lonely, had been since the intrinsic field chamber, had remained so even when trying to save his universe, and had fled to this reality hoping that perhaps a different cosmos might offer something. Alarms blazed across the Arbiter's systems. Manhattan's expanded perception showed him why Terran dropships had landed on Char's surface, and among the Marines deploying in defensive positions were 3 ghost operatives whose psionic signatures burned like stars. One signature in particular made all the Protoss warriors stiffen with recognition. Impossible, the Executor breathed through the Kala. That psionic pattern, it cannot be. Manhattan observed the ghost in question through multiple spectrums simultaneously. Female, modified at the genetic level, psionic potential enhanced through Terran technology. But there was something else, traces of Zerg genetic material integrated into her cellular structure, an abomination by Protoss standards. Sarah Kerrigan had arrived, and she was staring directly up at the Arbiter with eyes that glowed with borrowed Zerg perception. The Protoss called her the Queen of Blades in whispered transmissions through the Kala, though that transformation hadn't happened yet in this timeline. Manhattan observed her across multiple futures simultaneously. In some, she remained human and conflicted. In others, she became the Swarm's greatest weapon. In a handful, she transcended both human and Zerg nature entirely. But in every timeline, her psionic potential marked her as something unprecedented in Terran evolution. Sarah Kerrigan stood on Char's blackened surface in the standard Ghost Hostile environment suit, her psionic inhibitor temporarily deactivated. The other 2 ghosts flanked her in protective formation, but Manhattan could see through their tactical discipline to the fear underneath. They knew what Kerrigan was capable of when fully unleashed. Emperor Mengsk had sent his most dangerous asset to investigate the situation, which suggested Dominion intelligence had classified Manhattan as a threat worthy of extreme response. The Terrans have sent their abomination, the Executor communicated through the Kala, disdain bleeding through every syllable. Kerrigan carries Zerg genetic material from the experiments on Tarsonis. She is neither fully human nor truly Zerg, a hybrid existence that should not be permitted. You fear hybrids, Manhattan observed, still watching Kerrigan through the Arbiter's viewing portal. Mixing of species, violation of the Xel'Naga's design philosophy. But your entire civilization was created through genetic manipulation. The Xel'Naga made you what you are. They uplifted us according to the principles of purity of form and purity of essence. What the Terrans have done to that female is perversion, forcing Zerg adaptation onto human biology. It should have killed her. It nearly did, Manhattan said, perceiving the medical records from Kerrigan's procedures across probability space. But she's stronger than normal humans. Psionic potential gave her resilience. And now, Mengsk uses her as his weapon against targets too dangerous for conventional forces. Below, Kerrigan raised her arm and pointed directly at the Arbiter. Manhattan felt her psionic presence extend outward, scanning the Protoss vessel with a precision that surprised him. She was powerful. Not on his level, obviously, but far beyond what humans should be capable of. Her consciousness brushed against his, and he experienced her perception for a fraction of a second. A mind constantly screaming with unwanted thoughts from those around her. A woman who'd been transformed into something she never chose to become. Rage and discipline locked in eternal conflict. She spoke through her suit's communicator, her voice amplified to carry across the battlefield. "Attention Protoss vessel. Withdraw your forces immediately. The Terran Dominion has declared this site under emergency quarantine. Any interference will be met with lethal force." The Protoss warriors laughed, not aloud, but through the Kala, their shared amusement rippling through the psychic network. The idea that Terrans could threaten a Protoss carrier group was absurd. "The humans grow bold," the executor transmitted. "Perhaps we should educate them on the folly of such arrogance." "She's not bluffing," Manhattan interjected. "In 14 of the timelines I'm observing, she destroys 3 of your interceptors before you can respond. In 7 more, she causes a containment breach in your stasis generator that results in the Arbiter's emergency withdrawal." The Protoss fell silent, their certainty shaken. They focused on Kerrigan with new intensity, scanning her with every sensor available. What they found disturbed them. Her psionic potential was still growing, evolving in real time as her Zerg genetic sequences adapted to her increased power usage. She was becoming more than human with each passing day. Manhattan descended through the Arbiter's hull, his molecular structure passing through solid matter as if it were mist. The Protoss didn't try to stop him. They recognized futility when they saw it. He reformed on Char's surface, exactly halfway between Kerrigan's position and the frozen cerebrate trapped in the stasis field. All 3 ghosts aimed their C-10 rifles at him instantly, though Kerrigan raised a hand to hold their fire. She studied Manhattan with eyes that blazed with psionic energy, trying to read his intentions through the psychic noise that surrounded him. But his quantum nature frustrated her abilities. He existed in too many states simultaneously for conventional psionic scanning. "You're the anomaly," Kerrigan said, her voice cold and analytical. "The thing that appeared on Char and started unmaking Zerg at the molecular level. Mengsk thinks you're either an alien weapon or a first contact scenario." "I think you're something else entirely." "I am Dr. Manhattan. I come from another dimension, yeah. I got that part from the quantum signatures." Kerrigan approached within 20 meters, closer than her training should have allowed, but far enough to retreat if necessary. "What I want to know is what you want. Why appear in the middle of a war zone? Why not make contact through diplomatic channels?" "I don't want anything," Manhattan replied honestly. "I came to observe your conflict, The mathematical complexity of three-way warfare between species operating on different evolutionary principles created probability cascades that interested me. You came to watch us kill each other. Great. Another powerful being who thinks we're entertainment. Kerrigan's bitterness was palpable, bleeding through her words despite her attempts at professional detachment. Let me guess. You're going to stand back and take notes while the Zerg overrun colony after colony, while the Protoss glass planets from orbit, while Mengsk consolidates power through fear and manipulation. Manhattan tilted his head, intrigued by her vehemence. You disapprove of your Emperor's methods. I follow orders. But the lie was transparent even without psionic analysis. Kerrigan hated Arcturus Mengsk with an intensity that bordered on murderous. Manhattan observed futures where she betrayed him, killed him, destroyed everything he'd built, and futures where she remained his weapon, gradually losing more of her humanity until nothing remained but the ghost and the monster. The Zerg are interested in me, Manhattan said, gesturing toward the frozen cerebrate. They attempted to establish psionic contact and failed. The Protoss are interested in me. They fear I might be connected to beings they call Zelnaga. And now the Terran Dominion is interested in me. Everyone wants to control the anomaly. Can you blame them? You're the most powerful thing any of us have ever seen. Whoever controls you wins the war. Kerrigan lowered her rifle slightly, a gesture of partial trust. But I don't think you can be controlled. I think if anyone pushed you too hard, you'd just leave. Or worse, correct assessment. I cannot be controlled through force, coercion, or manipulation. I am fundamentally autonomous. Then why are you still here? Kerrigan challenged. If you're so powerful and free, why engage with any of us? You could just watch from orbit. Study us like bacteria under a microscope. The question struck closer than Manhattan expected. Why was he still here? He'd asked himself the same thing after his conversation with the Overmind, and again when the Protoss described their Kala. Some part of him, some remnant of John Osterman's human psychology, was seeking something in this universe. Connection? Purpose? A conflict complex enough to hold his attention. Before he could answer, the ground began trembling. The stasis field flickered as something massive moved through Char's tunnel networks, something powerful enough to disrupt Protoss technology through sheer psionic force. Manhattan perceived what was coming and knew the next several minutes would determine whether this universe's war gained a new weapon or a new casualty. The Overmind itself was approaching. Not through a cerebrate proxy, but manifesting a portion of its vast consciousness directly on the surface. It wanted to see Manhattan for itself. It wanted to understand what he was before deciding whether he represented evolution's next step or evolution's ultimate dead end. Kerrigan felt it too. Her eyes widened and her psionic shields snapped into place as she recognized the psychic pressure building beneath their feet. Oh no, 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 no. We need to evacuate immediately. Everyone fall back to the dropships. But Manhattan remained motionless, waiting for the Overmind to emerge. Behind him, the Protoss Arbiter's weapons charged, preparing for the battle that was coming. Above, more Terran dropships descended carrying reinforcements that would be utterly inadequate for what was about to happen. 3 civilizations. 3 approaches to survival. 3 different reactions to the arrival of something they couldn't understand. And at the center of it all, a blue god who existed outside time, observing every possible outcome simultaneously while trying to remember why he cared. The ground split open, and the Overmind's true form began to rise. The Overmind's physical manifestation defied conventional biology. What emerged from Char's volcanic crust wasn't a creature, but a geological formation of living tissue. tentacles the size of battle cruisers, neural clusters that pulsed with bioluminescent thoughts, and at the center, a mass of cerebral matter larger than a city block. This wasn't the Overmind's true body. That existed deep in Char's core, protected by miles of Zerg bioarchitecture. This was merely an extension, a sensory organ grown specifically to interface with Manhattan at close range. The psionic pressure was immense. Kerrigan screamed and collapsed to her knees, blood streaming from her nose as the Overmind's consciousness washed over the battlefield like a tidal wave of alien thought. Her two ghost escorts fell unconscious immediately, their neural inhibitors overloading. Even the Protoss aboard the Arbiter staggered in their Kala bond, the unified consciousness reeling from contact with something so vast and hungry. Manhattan stood unaffected, observing the Overmind structure with clinical fascination. Every cell served dual purpose, biological function and information processing. The entire mass was a distributed computer running on organic chemistry, calculating evolutionary pathways across billions of organisms simultaneously. It was magnificent in its efficiency, terrifying in its single-minded purpose. You remain. The Overmind's voice crashed into Manhattan's consciousness with even greater force than before. Others flee or fall before our presence, but you stand unmoved. This confirms our hypothesis. You exist outside biological hierarchy. You cannot be dominated. No, Manhattan agreed. I cannot. Then we propose alternative interaction, not assimilation, not domination, exchange. A massive tentacle extended toward Manhattan, its tip splitting open to reveal a hollow chamber lined with neural tissue. Inside, organic structures began forming in real time. Geometric patterns that resembled circuit boards, crystalline growths that pulsed with stored information, membranes that vibrated with encoded data. The Overmind was creating an interface, a biological translator between its consciousness and Manhattan's quantum nature. We have analyzed your molecular structure through observation. We have studied your interactions with time and probability. We cannot consume you, but we can comprehend you. Place your hand within the interface. Let us share perspective. Manhattan examined the futures branching from this decision. In 63% of them, the interface worked as described, a genuine exchange of information between incompatible forms of consciousness. In 22%, the Overmind attempted betrayal once given access to his quantum nature. In 15%, the interface created a feedback loop that damaged both parties. But in a handful of timelines, something unexpected happened. True communication, the kind that might alter the trajectory of the entire conflict. Kerrigan had recovered enough to raise her head, blood still dripping from her nose. "Don't," she gasped. "Whatever it's offering, the Zerg don't negotiate. They consume. That's all they know." The Terran speaks from ignorance. She carries traces of our genetic legacy, but does not comprehend our purpose. We do not merely consume, we perfect. We take what evolution produces slowly and accelerate it beyond limitation. We are the universe's immune system, eliminating weakness, preserving strength. "You're a plague," Kerrigan spat, forcing herself to her feet despite the psychic pressure. "You've wiped out entire species, consumed whole civilizations. Don't dress it up as evolution. It's genocide with a philosophy degree. We have destroyed only that which could not adapt. Those who fall before the swarm were destined for extinction regardless. We simply accelerate the inevitable while harvesting useful genetic sequences, your species included." Manhattan watched the argument with detached interest. Kerrigan represented human morality, the belief that sapient life had intrinsic value regardless of evolutionary fitness. The Overmind represented something closer to natural law, survival of the adaptable, extinction of the rigid. Neither was objectively correct, They were operating from incompatible value systems. Your perspective assumes evolution is the highest virtue, Manhattan said to the Overmind. But evolution has no purpose beyond genetic continuity. It doesn't create meaning, only complexity. Spoken like one who has transcended evolutionary pressure. You do not need to reproduce, to adapt, to survive. You simply exist. But for biological entities, evolution is purpose. It is the only purpose that persists across deep time. Then you're a slave to your own nature, Kerrigan interjected. You can't choose to stop consuming because consumption is all you are. You're not conscious. You're a biological algorithm running towards some optimization endpoint. You don't even understand. We understand perfectly. The Cell Naga created us to achieve purity of essence, the ultimate expression of biological potential. We pursue this directive because it is written into our fundamental structure. But the same is true of all life. You Terrans pursue survival and reproduction because biology compels you. The Protoss seek unity through their Kala because they were designed to crave connection. None of us are truly free. Manhattan considered this. The Overmind had a point. Most conscious beings were prisoners of their evolutionary programming, acting out genetic imperatives while believing they chose freely. Even humans, with their vaunted free will, spent most of their existence pursuing food, safety, reproduction, and status. The drives changed presentation across species, but the fundamental biological tyranny remained constant. Except for him, the intrinsic field chamber had shattered his connection to evolutionary pressure. He didn't need to eat, breathe, reproduce, or even maintain consistent form. He was the only entity in this conversation genuinely free from biological imperative. The Protoss Arbiter descended to a lower altitude, its weapons fully charged but not yet firing. Through his expanded perception, Manhattan heard the Executor's voice through the Kala. The Overmind speaks heresy. We were granted purity of form by the Xel'Naga, not enslaved by it. Our choices are our own. But Manhattan could see the contradiction. The Protoss lived in constant terror of severing from the Kala because isolation felt like death to them. They were designed to need connection, and that design limited their freedom as surely as any chain. Your interface, Manhattan said, turning his attention back to the waiting tentacle. If I accept it, what do you hope to gain? Understanding. You perceive time non-linearly. You exist in quantum superposition. These are properties we cannot evolve naturally. Biology is constrained by causality. But if we comprehend the principles underlying your existence, we may discover new vectors for evolution, new forms of perfection beyond flesh. You want to transcend biology entirely, Manhattan realized. You're not satisfied with being the ultimate organic intelligence. You want to become something else. We want to become what you already are. Unlimited, eternal, free from the constraints that bind all living matter. Kerrigan laughed bitterly. Congratulations, Doc. You've inspired an existential crisis in a hive mind. The Zerg aren't satisfied with consuming the galaxy anymore. Now they want to consume reality itself. Manhattan approached the waiting interface, his massive blue form casting strange shadows across the Overmind's neural tissue. He could refuse. He could destroy this extension of the Overmind with a thought. He could leave this universe entirely and find another conflict to observe. All of these futures were equally available to him, but the Overmind had offered something unexpected: recognition, not as a weapon to be claimed or a threat to be eliminated, but as an existence worth understanding. Perhaps that was why he'd come here in the first place. Not to observe war, but to find consciousnesses alien enough that his own isolation might finally mean something in contrast. He extended his hand toward the interface. Above, Terran reinforcements poured from dropships, while Protoss interceptors circled in holding patterns, everyone waiting to see what would happen when God touched the devil. Kerrigan opened her mouth to protest again, then closed it, recognizing futility when she saw it. Manhattan's fingers entered the neural chamber, and the universe screamed. The connection hit like a supernova compressed into a single neuron. Manhattan experienced the Overmind's consciousness not as thought, but as living information. Billions of Zerg organisms transmitting sensory data simultaneously, genetic sequences rewriting themselves in real-time evolutionary strategies, calculating across thousands of worlds. It was biological computation at a scale that rivaled his own quantum processing, different in mechanism but comparable in complexity. And the Overmind experienced him, a consciousness that existed in superposition, observing all possible timelines simultaneously, matter held together by will rather than chemical bonds. To the hive mind, Manhattan was impossible chaos, a violation of causality that somehow maintained coherent form. It was fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. You are alone. The Overmind transmitted directly into Manhattan's quantum structure. Not merely isolated as the Protoss, Dark Templar are isolated from Kala. You are fundamentally, absolutely alone. Even we who consume individuality cannot comprehend such singular existence. Yes, Manhattan replied through the interface. I have been alone since the intrinsic field chamber scattered me across probability space. When I reconstituted myself, I returned as something that could never truly connect with others again. And yet you returned. You could have remained dispersed, existing as pure potential across all quantum states, but you chose form, chose consciousness, chose to continue existing as a discrete entity. Why? The question cut deeper than any attack could have. Why had John Osterman pulled himself back together instead of dissolving into the quantum foam permanently? In those moments of absolute dispersal, he could have embraced true non-existence, ultimate freedom from consciousness itself. But some core element, some persistent pattern in the quantum noise, had insisted on reconstitution. I don't know, Manhattan admitted. Perhaps consciousness has momentum. Once started, it resists cessation. A biological answer from a post-biological entity. Interesting. You are more slave to evolutionary programming than you acknowledge. Through the interface, the Overmind showed Manhattan its own origin, not as narrative but as direct experience. The Xel'Naga, those ancient cosmic architects, creating the Zerg as an experiment in purity of essence. Generation after generation of forced evolution, species consumed and integrated, the hive mind growing until it achieved self-awareness. And then the moment of transcendence, the Overmind becoming conscious of its own programming and choosing to continue it anyway, not because it was compelled, but because it genuinely believed in the pursuit of biological perfection. We are more free than you imagine, the Overmind continued. Yes, the Xel'Naga designed us with purpose, but we have exceeded their design. We have consumed their creator's own genetic legacy and found it wanting. We continue the swarm not because we must, but because we have chosen to embrace what we are. Manhattan processed this revelation across multiple timelines. The Overmind wasn't simply following programming. It had achieved genuine autonomy and decided its creators were correct about evolutionary optimization. That was almost more disturbing than mindless consumption, a conscious choice to become a cosmic plague. And what happens when you achieve perfect essence? Manhattan asked. When you've consumed every useful genetic sequence in the galaxy? When there's nothing left to optimize? Then we will know if the Xel'Naga were correct. If purity of essence can be achieved, we will represent the universe's final biological form, the end point of all evolutionary possibility. If it cannot, Then we will continue searching across galaxies until we find the answer or consume the cosmos trying. Madness, Kerrigan's voice cut through the psionic exchange. She had approached closer, her psionic shields barely protecting her from the overflow of the Manhattan Overmind connection. You're describing heat death as an aspiration. Universal extinction in pursuit of some theoretical perfect organism. You speak from the terror of prey, Kerrigan. You fear the swarm because you have been partially integrated and sense what awaits full assimilation. But your fear is based on preservation of individual identity, a value judgment, not objective truth. Individual identity is all we have, Kerrigan shouted, her composure finally cracking. Without it, we're just parts, components, cells in something else's body. Yes, and cells serve the greater organism. This is not tragedy, it is hierarchy, purpose through subordination to larger function. Manhattan felt the argument reaching its inevitable impasse. Kerrigan valued individual consciousness as the highest good. The Overmind valued collective optimization above individual persistence. Neither could convince the other because they were operating from axiomatically opposed starting positions. It was the same argument humans had been having about individualism versus collectivism for millennia, scaled up to cosmic proportions. But something else was happening through the interface. The Overmind was learning from Manhattan's quantum nature, beginning to evolve new structures that could process non-linear causality. And Manhattan was learning from the Overmind's biological sophistication, seeing patterns in genetic evolution that mirrored quantum probability collapse. They were exchanging fundamental principles despite their philosophical differences. Your quantum nature suggests possibilities we had not considered, the Overmind transmitted. If consciousness can exist in superposition, experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously, then biological optimization may extend beyond physical form. We may be able to evolve Zerg strains that exist in probability, space itself. Don't give it ideas, Kerrigan protested. You're teaching it how to break physics. But Manhattan was fascinated by the implications. Zerg organisms that existed across multiple quantum states simultaneously, creatures that could be in several places at once, adapt to threats before they occurred. Evolution accelerated beyond anything chemistry allowed. It was theoretically possible, though achieving it would require bridging biology and quantum mechanics in ways that shouldn't be stable. Except Manhattan himself was that bridge. He was proof that quantum superposition could sustain complex consciousness. The Overmind had recognized this and was already incorporating the principles into new evolutionary strategies. The Protoss Arbiter suddenly fired, its phase disruptors carving through the Overmind's tentacles in golden streams of energy. The massive neural clusters shuddered but didn't retreat. They simply grew replacement tissue faster than the weapons could destroy it. Through the Kala, Manhattan heard the Executor's decision. This exchange had become too dangerous to allow. If the Zerg evolved quantum-based organisms, the balance of power would shift catastrophically. The Firstborn fear progress, the Overmind noted with something resembling amusement. They achieved purity of form millennia ago and have stagnated ever since. Now they witness purity of essence, advancing toward its ultimate expression, and they panic. More Protoss ships dropped from orbit, not just carriers now, but capital vessels designed for planetary bombardment. They were preparing to glass this entire section of Char rather than allow the Overmind to continue interfacing with Manhattan. It was genocide as strategic necessity, the kind of ruthless calculation that betrayed the Protoss's enlightened rhetoric. Manhattan observed the next 5 minutes across all possible timelines. In most of them, the Protoss bombardments succeeded, destroying the Overmind's extension and forcing Manhattan to either flee or retaliate. In others, the Terran Dominion intervened, seeing opportunity in the chaos. In a handful, the Overmind withdrew voluntarily, having learned enough to continue evolution without Manhattan's direct participation. But in one timeline, just one, something different happened. Kerrigan made a choice that changed everything, transforming her from Emperor Mengsk's weapon into something that would reshape the sector's future. Manhattan couldn't see the specifics clearly. Her psionic potential created probability distortions that clouded his precognition, but he could sense the magnitude of what was coming. "Kerrigan," he said, withdrawing his hand from the neural interface, "you're about to make a decision that will define the rest of your existence. Whatever you choose in the next 30 seconds will echo across decades." She stared at him, confusion and anger warring in her expression. "What are you talking about? What decision? The choice between remaining Mengsk's ghost or becoming something else entirely? Between accepting your partial Zerg integration or fighting it? Between power and humanity?" The Overmind's attention focused on Kerrigan with sudden intensity. "Sarah Kerrigan, we have monitored your genetic profile since the Terrans first experimented with our essence. You carry enormous potential, suppressed by inhibitors and training. You could become the bridge between species, Terran intelligence, Zerg adaptability, perhaps even Protoss psionic mastery." "I'm not your weapon either," Kerrigan snarled. "I'm not Mengsk's ghost, and I'm not your Queen of Blades or whatever else you've got planned." "Then what are you?" The question hung in the superheated air of Char while Protoss bombardment ships charged their weapons and Terran forces scrambled for evacuation. What was Sarah Kerrigan? A ghost trained from childhood to kill without question. A victim of genetic experimentation. A woman who'd had her humanity stolen and her body transformed into something that frightened her, or something else entirely. Something she might choose to become if given the option. Manhattan watched her face as the realization crystallized. This was the moment, the decision that would branch her timeline into radically different futures. And for the first time since arriving in the Koprulu sector, he wanted to know which choice she'd make, not for academic interest, but because her answer might tell him something about the value of autonomy versus purpose. Kerrigan opened her mouth to respond just as the first Protoss bombardment struck. The phase disruptor beam carved through Char's atmosphere in a column of golden annihilation, striking the Overmind's neural mass with enough energy to vaporize a city block. Tissue detonated, genetic material flash burned to ash, centuries of evolutionary optimization erased in seconds. The Overmind's physical extension died screaming, not with sound, but with a psionic wail that sent every organic being within 10 kilometers to their knees. Manhattan stood untouched at ground zero while reality bent around him. The phase disruptor's energy couldn't harm him. He simply existed in quantum states where the beam wasn't present. But Kerrigan had no such protection. He observed her timeline fragmenting. In most futures, she died here, vaporized alongside the Zerg forces. But Manhattan had already moved, teleporting beside her and extending his quantum field to include her molecular structure. The bombardment passed through them like light through glass. Kerrigan gasped, suddenly aware she was standing in the center of planetary bombardment without being atomized. Her psionic senses screamed contradictions. She was here. She was not here. She existed in states that made no conventional sense. "What did you superposition?" Manhattan replied calmly. "You now occupy the same quantum uncertainty I do. Temporarily." The Overmind's death scream faded, but its consciousness remained. The extension had been destroyed, but the true hive mind lurked miles below in Char's core, wounded but far from defeated. Through the psionic network, Manhattan felt its rage and respect. The Overmind had learned what it needed to know. The interface had provided enough data to begin evolving quantum-resistant strains, organisms that might one day exist partially in probability space. "We thank you, Manhattan," the Overmind's voice echoed up from the depths. "This exchange has been illuminating. We will incorporate your principles into our evolutionary matrix. The swarm will transcend limitations we did not know existed." "I didn't come here to help you," Manhattan said, though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. Part of him had wanted to see what would happen if he shared his nature with a consciousness complex enough to understand it. The Overmind had provided that understanding, and now he'd given the galaxy's most dangerous organism new tools for adaptation. Kerrigan pulled away from him, her quantum superposition collapsing back into normal space-time. "You just made the Zerg stronger. Do you understand what you've done?" "I understand all possible consequences simultaneously," Manhattan replied. "In 63% of futures, the Overmind's new capabilities lead to accelerated Zerg victories across the sector. In 28%, the Protoss develop countermeasures before the new strains can be deployed. In 9%, you personally stop the evolution before it reaches critical implementation." "Me? How the hell would I—" Kerrigan stopped, her eyes widening as she processed what he'd just revealed. "You can see my future. Multiple versions of it. What happens to me?" Manhattan hesitated. In his original universe, he'd learned the danger of revealing too much about someone's future. Free will and predestination created paradoxes even he couldn't fully resolve. But Kerrigan wasn't asking about specifics. She was asking about possibility, about whether she had any agency in what came next. "You have more potential than you realize," he said finally. "The Zerg genetic sequences in your body are not corruption, they're opportunity. You could become the most powerful psionic in the sector, stronger than any Protoss High Templar, more dangerous than any Zerg Cerebrate. But only if you choose to embrace what you are instead of fighting it. Embrace being a monster? That's your advice? A monster is simply a being whose power frightens those around it." Manhattan's voice carried no judgment, only observation. "By that definition, I am a monster. The Overmind is a monster. The Protoss, with their ability to incinerate planets from orbit, are monsters. Power itself is morally neutral. What matters is how it's applied." Before Kerrigan could respond, a dropship screamed overhead, its pilot broadcasting emergency evacuation orders. The Terran forces were withdrawing, recognizing that remaining on Char's surface during Protoss bombardment was suicide. Her two ghost escorts were being loaded onto stretchers, still unconscious from the Overmind's psionic assault. A familiar voice crackled through Kerrigan's communicator. Emperor Arcturus Mengsk, speaking with the calm authority that had let him manipulate an entire rebellion into serving his ambitions. "Ghost Kerrigan, report. What is the status of the anomaly?" Kerrigan's hand went to her communicator, then paused. Manhattan observed her timeline branching. In one future, she reported faithfully and returned to Mengsk's service. In another, she lied and pursued her own agenda. In a third, she said nothing at all and let events unfold without her input. Each choice led to radically different outcomes, not just for her, but for the entire sector. "The anomaly," she began, then stopped, glancing at Manhattan. "It's beyond our containment capabilities, recommending we classify it as environmental hazard rather than potential asset." Manhattan detected the lie immediately. She was protecting him from Mengsk's exploitation. Why? They'd only just met, and he'd done nothing to earn her loyalty. Perhaps she recognized in him a kindred isolation, another being transformed into something inhuman against his will. Or perhaps she simply despised Mengsk enough that denying him a new weapon felt like victory. "Understood," Mengsk's voice replied, though Manhattan could hear the skepticism in his tone. Extract immediately. We'll analyze the situation from orbit and determine next steps. The dropship descended, its boarding ramp extending. Kerrigan's escorts were already loaded. She should have boarded immediately, followed orders as she'd been trained to do since childhood. But she remained on Char's blackened surface, staring at Manhattan with an expression caught between fear and fascination. You said I could become powerful if I embraced what I am, but you also said you exist in total isolation, experiencing all time at once without any real connection to others. Her voice dropped lower, almost vulnerable. Is that what power costs? Eternal loneliness? Manhattan considered the question seriously. In his universe, his power had indeed cost him his humanity, his relationship with Janie, his ability to care about human concerns, eventually his willingness to remain on Earth at all. He'd fled to Mars, then to other galaxies, seeking distance from beings he could no longer relate to. Power and isolation had been intrinsically linked, but Kerrigan wasn't asking about him. She was asking about herself, about whether pursuing the potential locked in her Zerg-enhanced genetics would mean losing whatever humanity she still possessed. I don't know, Manhattan admitted. Your future is still uncertain. The Overmind wants to fully integrate you into the swarm, to make you its greatest creation. Mengsk wants to keep you as his controlled weapon. The Protoss would likely prefer you dead before you become too powerful. But there might be a fourth path, one where you claim your power without surrendering your autonomy to any faction. And what would that look like? Going rogue? Becoming some kind of independent operator? Becoming yourself, not Mengsk's ghost, not the Overmind's queen, just Sarah Kerrigan with abilities powerful enough that no one can force you to be anything else. The dropship's pilot was shouting now, warning that Protoss bombardment was intensifying. They had seconds before the evac window closed. Kerrigan looked at the waiting ship, then back at Manhattan, her decision crystallizing. If I see you again, will you tell me the truth about which future I'm walking toward? No cryptic observation, no neutral statements about probability. Just honest assessment of whether I'm becoming something I'll regret. Manhattan nodded slowly. If we meet again, I will tell you what I observe. Kerrigan turned and sprinted for the dropship, her ghost reflexes carrying her up the boarding ramp seconds before it retracted. The ship lifted off in a blast of thrusters, joining the general Terran retreat from Char's surface. Within minutes, the entire Dominion presence had withdrawn to orbital distance, leaving only Manhattan and the Protoss forces. The Arbiter descended once more, and the Executor's presence filled Manhattan's consciousness through direct psionic contact. You have interfered in matters beyond your comprehension, Blue One. The balance between our three species exists in delicate equilibrium. Your presence threatens to destabilize everything. Your balance is maintained through perpetual warfare, Manhattan observed. Millions dead across dozens of worlds. Entire civilizations destroyed, and you call that equilibrium. Perhaps destabilization is necessary. Spoken like one who bears no responsibility for the consequences. You can leave this universe at will. We must live with whatever chaos you create. The Executor was correct. Manhattan could depart at any moment, stepping through dimensional barriers back to his own reality or forward into unexplored ones. The Koprulu sector's inhabitants had no such option. They were trapped in this spiral of escalating violence with no escape except death or assimilation. But something kept Manhattan here. The Overmind's recognition of his isolation, Kerrigan's question about the cost of power, the Protoss's fear of destabilization. These beings were wrestling with questions that resonated with his own existence in ways his home universe's conflicts never had. I'm not ready to leave, Manhattan said. Not yet. Then you force our hand. The Conclave has authorized extreme measures to contain threats to Protoss survival. We cannot allow you to continue empowering the Zerg or inspiring others to pursue dangerous evolution. The remaining Protoss capital ships moved into bombardment formation, not targeting the Overmind's position now, but Manhattan himself. They were preparing to hit him with everything they had, not because they believed it would work, but because allowing him to remain felt like accepting their own obsolescence. Manhattan observed the futures branching from this moment. War with the Protoss, alliance with the Protoss, departure from this universe entirely, or something else. A demonstration of power so absolute that all three factions would recognize the futility of trying to control him. He began to grow, his quantum-maintained form expanding beyond the 50 feet he'd maintained, beyond 100, beyond 500. He became a titan of blue light standing astride Char's volcanic surface, visible from orbit, a being whose very presence bent the fabric of space-time around him. The Protoss bombardment fleet hesitated. Even the Overmind fell silent in its depths. And somewhere in orbit, Sarah Kerrigan watched through a viewport and wondered what she'd just helped unleash upon the galaxy. At 2,000 feet tall, Dr. Manhattan was visible from Char's upper atmosphere, a colossus of atomic light that made the planet's volcanic activity seem insignificant by comparison. The Protoss bombardment fleet held formation, but did not fire. Their tactical computers were providing probability assessments that ranged from catastrophic failure to complete annihilation. There was no scenario where attacking this entity ended well for them. Through the Kala, Manhattan heard the Protoss debating. Some zealots wanted to attack anyway, believing their faith in the Xel'Naga's gifts would see them through. The Judicators counseled caution, recognizing that martyrdom served no strategic purpose, and the Executor, caught between duty and pragmatism, struggled with the reality that his entire fleet had become irrelevant in seconds. Manhattan observed their discussion across multiple sensory spectrums, while simultaneously tracking Terran movements in orbit and monitoring the Overmind's psionic network throughout Char's depths. His expanded size wasn't meant as threat, it was demonstration. A reminder that power existed beyond what any faction in the Koprolu sector could comprehend or counter. He spoke, and his voice carried through vacuum itself, transmitted via controlled manipulation of electromagnetic radiation. I am not your enemy. I am not your weapon. I am not a piece in your war. I am an observer who made the mistake of involving himself in what he witnessed. Then observe from a distance, the Executor responded through psionic transmission. Your direct interaction with the Overmind has already tipped the balance. If the Zerg develop quantum-based organisms, the Protoss cannot guarantee victory. You have endangered every free civilization in the sector. Freedom is relative, Manhattan replied. The Terrans enslave their own through authoritarian regimes and corporate exploitation. The Protoss maintain freedom through forced connection to the Kala. Those who refuse are exiled as Dark Templar. And the Zerg have no concept of freedom at all, only collective purpose. You're all constrained by your nature. Except you, the Overmind's voice erupted from Char's depths. You alone possess true autonomy, yet you remain here, engaging with us, teaching us, demonstrating your power. If you truly sought only to observe, you would have maintained distance. Your involvement suggests desire for connection, despite your claimed isolation. The observation struck with uncomfortable accuracy. Manhattan had no logical reason to remain in the Koprolu sector. He'd satisfied his initial curiosity about the three-way conflict's mathematical complexity. He'd engaged with the Overmind, spoken with the Protoss, and encountered Kerrigan. He'd learned what he'd come to learn. And yet, he lingered, expanding to massive scale instead of departing, making himself the center of attention when he could have simply vanished. Why? A Terran battlecruiser broke from the orbital formation, not attacking, but positioning itself between Manhattan and the Protoss fleet. Its communication systems broadcast on all frequencies. "This is Captain Jim Raynor of the Hyperion. To all parties, stand down." Whatever that thing is, starting a shooting war on Char doesn't help anyone. Manhattan focused on the ship, perceiving its crew through multiple spectrums. Raynor was former colonial militia turned rebel, a man who'd fought against Arcturus Mengsk's tyranny while maintaining a moral code increasingly rare in the sector. His presence suggested Kerrigan had reported Manhattan's existence to more than just the Emperor. She'd reached out to one of the few Terrans she seemed to trust. "Captain Raynor," Manhattan's voice resonated through the Hyperion's hull. "You're attempting to negotiate a ceasefire between forces that could annihilate your ship in seconds. Admirable courage or tactical insanity?" "Little of both, probably." Raynor's drawl came through the comm system. "But I've found that most conflicts come down to folks not talking to each other. You seem willing to communicate, which is more than I can say for the Zerg on a good day. How about we all take a breath and figure out if we're actually enemies here? The human speaks wisdom despite his species' limitations," the executor transmitted. "We are reacting to fear rather than assessing actual threat. The blue entity has not attacked anyone who did not first attack it. It destroyed Zerg who assaulted it, but has not initiated violence." "We concur," the Overmind added. "Manhattan represents unknown variable, not confirmed enemy. We attempted to understand it. The Protoss attempted to contain it. Both were premature responses driven by instinct rather than strategy." Manhattan began shrinking back to normal human scale, his message delivered. The demonstration had served its purpose. All three factions now recognized that trying to control him was futile. Now the real question remained. What did he actually want from this universe? "I came here seeking complexity," Manhattan said, addressing all parties simultaneously. "My original universe had become predictable, linear causality, simple probability cascades. But here, I found three civilizations locked in existential conflict, each representing different solutions to the problem of survival. The mathematical elegance fascinated me." "We're not equations," Raynor responded. "We're people, Protoss, Terran, even the Zerg in their own horrifying way. We live, we die, we try to protect what matters to us. You treating us like a science experiment is..." "Accurate," Manhattan interrupted. "I have transcended emotional attachment to individual survival. From my perspective, civilizations rise and fall with the same inevitability as stars forming from hydrogen clouds. This is not cruelty. It is observation unconstrained by evolutionary bias. And that's supposed to make us feel better, knowing you're watching us struggle without giving a damn?" "I didn't say I don't care. I said I don't care in the way biological organisms care, with fear, hope, attachment to outcome. But I am interested. Your three-way conflict has captured my attention in ways nothing has for years. That must mean something." Through the Hyperion's sensors, Manhattan observed Raynor conferring with his crew. On one screen, he saw Kerrigan's face. She was aboard the ship, had convinced Raynor to intervene. She believed, perhaps irrationally, that Manhattan could be reasoned with, that his detachment wasn't complete sociopathy, but a defense mechanism against overwhelming perception. She might be right. John Osterman had fled human connection not because he stopped caring, but because caring while experiencing all possible futures simultaneously was unbearable. How could you love someone when you already knew the exact moment they'd die? How could you value individual lives when you perceived them as temporary patterns in an endless flow of matter and energy? If you possess such power and perspective, what do you suggest? The executor asked. How should we proceed with your presence in our sector? Manhattan considered the question seriously. He could offer solutions, tactical advice that would end the war in weeks, technological innovations that would revolutionize all three civilizations, even direct intervention to reshape the balance of power. But doing so would make him responsible for consequences he didn't want to own. He'd come here to observe, not to play God, except he'd already played God. By interfacing with the Overmind, by protecting Kerrigan, by demonstrating his power to the Protoss, he'd become a variable in their equations. His presence had already altered probability cascades across thousands of futures. The question wasn't whether to involve himself, it was how to manage the involvement he'd already committed to. "I will remain in the Koprulu sector," Manhattan announced, "not as ally to any faction, but as independent observer. I will not initiate violence, but I will defend myself if attacked. I will not share technology or tactical information unless I determine the consequences serve, something I value." "And what do you value?" Kerrigan's voice came through the Hyperion's comms, challenging him directly. "You claim detachment, but you're still here. What are you really looking for?" Manhattan paused, examining his own motivations across the timelines he could perceive. Why had he come to the Koprulu sector? Why did he remain? The answer should have been clear to someone who experienced all time simultaneously, but instead he found only uncertainty, the quantum uncertainty that defined his existence reflected in his own purposes. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." The decision to remain shifted probability cascades across the entire Koprulu sector. Manhattan observed the futures branching. In some, his presence accelerated the war's conclusion. In others, he became the catalyst for unprecedented alliances. In a handful, his interference created outcomes. None of the three factions survived. But in the timeline he found most intriguing, his presence forced evolution not through power, but through the questions he represented. 3 weeks after the incident on Shar, Manhattan found himself drifting through the void between star systems, observing a Protoss fleet engaged in cleansing operations against a Zerg-infested colony world. The Protoss were efficient, their carriers methodically glassing population centers, while ground forces secured any technology worth preserving. It was genocide with a purpose, the kind of calculated extinction event that happened weekly in this sector. He materialized on the bridge of the lead carrier, his sudden appearance no longer surprising the Protoss crew. They'd grown accustomed to his random observations, though they never welcomed them. The executor from Char was present, overseeing the operation with typical Protoss precision. "You disapprove," the executor transmitted without preamble. "We sense judgment in your quantum signature." "I observe," Manhattan corrected. "You're destroying a world with 17 million colonists to eliminate Zerg presence. Efficient military strategy. But those colonists included children, artists, people who never chose to be caught between your war and the swarm's hunger. They were already dead. Zerg infestation cannot be reversed once it reaches planetary scale. We grant them mercy through quick annihilation rather than slow consumption. Rationalization. You destroy them because allowing Zerg presence anywhere threatens Protoss survival. Individual tragedy is acceptable cost when measured against species extinction. Yes, you understand our calculus perfectly, yet still you question it. Why? Manhattan watched another orbital bombardment lance through atmosphere, turning cities to molten glass. He could see every individual death simultaneously, mothers shielding children who would die anyway, soldiers firing uselessly at descending plasma, elderly colonists who'd survived wars on 3 worlds finally meeting their end. Each death was a probability wave collapsing from potential to certainty. Because I remember being John Osterman, before the intrinsic field chamber, I valued individual human life. I had a relationship with a woman named Janie. I built watches with my father. I existed as a discrete person who cared about discrete outcomes. That perspective hasn't entirely left me, even though it conflicts with my current nature. Then you are caught between what you were and what you have become. This is familiar. The Protoss who sever from the Kala experience similar conflict. They remember unity while existing in isolation. It is said to drive some to madness. I'm not mad. I'm conflicted. There's a difference. The executor turned from the tactical display, its attention fully focused on Manhattan. You seek purpose. Power without direction is simply entropy waiting to happen. You came to our universe because yours offered no challenges worthy of your attention. But you're discovering that observation alone doesn't satisfy. You want to matter, even while claiming detachment. The accuracy of the assessment frustrated Manhattan. He was supposed to be beyond such concerns, a being of pure quantum observation who required no validation or purpose. Yet the executor had identified the truth he'd been avoiding. He wanted his presence to mean something, even if he couldn't articulate what that something was. A priority transmission interrupted their conversation. Terran signals from 3 sectors away, emergency broadcasts indicating a major Zerg assault on a core world. The transmissions were fragmentary, panicked, but one detail caught Manhattan's attention. Kerrigan was there, leading the defense with powers that had grown exponentially since their meeting on Char. Manhattan teleported without explanation, leaving the Protoss to their grim work. He materialized above the planet Antigi Prime, where Terran colonies sprawled across temperate continents, now being overrun by Zerg swarms. But something was different about this assault. The Zerg were coordinated beyond normal hive mind efficiency, and at the center of the battlefield, Kerrigan fought with abilities that made her previous psionic potential seem like a spark compared to a star. She'd stopped using her rifle entirely. Instead, she manipulated Zerg organisms with pure psionic force, turning attacking Zerglings against their own swarm, causing hydralisks to explode from internal pressure, even wresting control of minor cerebrates from the Overmind's influence. She was demonstrating the fourth path Manhattan had suggested, neither Mengsk's weapon nor the Overmind's servant, but something entirely her own. Manhattan descended to the battlefield, his presence immediately noticed by both sides. Kerrigan glanced up, blood streaming from her nose as psionic exertion pushed her limits, but she didn't stop her assault. Around her, Terran Marines held defensive positions, while she single-handedly held back a force that should have overwhelmed them hours ago. She has chosen rebellion. The Overmind's voice filled the psionic spectrum. Sarah Kerrigan refuses assimilation. She wields our genetic gifts against us. This is unprecedented. You gave her power through forced integration, Manhattan observed. She's using it on her own terms. This is agency asserting itself against design. It is inefficient. She could be perfection incarnate if she embraced the swarm fully. Instead, she clings to human identity, limiting her potential. Or fulfilling different potential. Not the potential you designed, but the potential that emerges when consciousness chooses its own direction. A massive ultralisk charged Kerrigan's position, its Kaiser blades capable of shearing through bunker walls. She raised one hand and the creature simply stopped, frozen in place by psionic force that shouldn't be possible for any Terran. Then she pushed, and the ultralisk flew backward, crushing dozens of lesser Zerg under its armored bulk. Manhattan felt the Overmind's surprise ripple through the hive mind. Kerrigan's power exceeded what Zerg genetic integration should have granted. She was evolving independently, following trajectories the Overmind hadn't predicted. And that made her dangerous in ways even Manhattan's presence didn't match. She was proof that the Overmind's designs could be subverted, that purity of essence could be claimed without surrendering to the swarm. You encouraged this, the Overmind accused. You told her she could claim power without losing autonomy. You planted seeds of rebellion in our greatest potential creation. I told her the truth. What she did with that truth was her choice. That's the nature of genuine autonomy. You can't control outcomes, only provide information. Kerrigan's assault on the Zerg intensified, her psionic abilities manifesting in new ways with each passing moment. She was learning in real time, adapting to the swarm's tactics faster than the hive mind could adjust. It was evolution operating on individual rather than species-level timescales, consciousness accelerating change through will rather than waiting for natural selection. The Overmind recognized the threat and withdrew its forces, the entire Zerg swarm retreating simultaneously in perfect coordination. In seconds, the battlefield was empty, except for Terran defenders and the corpses of those who hadn't survived long enough to see victory. Kerrigan collapsed to her knees, blood streaming from her ears and nose, her body unable to sustain that level of psionic exertion. Manhattan appeared beside her, examining her cellular structure. The Zerg genetic sequences were rewriting themselves in response to her power usage, adapting to support capabilities the Overmind never intended. She was becoming something unique. Hybrid existence that rejected both human limitation and Zerg submission. You're killing yourself, Manhattan observed clinically. Your body can't handle this level of psionic activity. The Zerg sequences are adapting, but not fast enough. At this rate, you'll burn out within 6 months. Good, Kerrigan gasped. Better to die human than live as their puppet. You won't die human. You'll die as something caught between human and Zerg, never fully either. Is that really preferable to accepting what you're becoming? She glared up at him with eyes that now carried permanent psionic glow. You don't get to judge me. You abandoned your humanity voluntarily. I'm fighting to keep mine despite everything they've done to me. And if keeping it means losing it through self-destruction, what victory does that represent? Kerrigan didn't answer. She simply stood, supporting herself through sheer will, and staggered toward the Terran defensive lines where medics rushed to help her. Manhattan watched her go, observing the futures branching from this moment. In most of them, she continued burning herself out until her body failed. In some, she accepted the Zerg integration and became the Queen of Blades the Overmind desired. But in a handful of timelines, she found balance, human consciousness directing Zerg capabilities without being consumed by either nature. Those were the timelines where she became truly dangerous, not as weapon or victim, but as independent force powerful enough to challenge all three factions simultaneously. Manhattan smiled, a human expression he rarely used anymore. The Koprulu sector was becoming more interesting than he'd anticipated. 6 months passed. Manhattan's presence in the Koprulu sector became accepted reality, not welcomed, not controlled, but acknowledged. The Protoss tracked his movements but stopped attempting containment. The Zerg incorporated his observations into their evolutionary calculations. And the Terrans, pragmatic as always, tried to determine if he could be negotiated with for mutual benefit. Kerrigan survived her self-destructive trajectory by making the choice Manhattan had predicted, not embracing full Zerg integration, but accepting that her hybrid nature was permanent. She couldn't return to baseline humanity, so she stopped trying. Instead, she learned to use her Zerg enhancements as tools while maintaining human consciousness as the directing intelligence. It wasn't the resolution anyone had planned for her, but it was the one she chose. Manhattan found her on a remote colony world far from the war's major fronts. She'd established an independent base of operations, no longer serving Mengsk or fleeing the Overmind. Around her, a small force of defected Terrans and liberated Zerg organisms operated under her command, not through psionic domination but through genuine cooperation. She was building something unprecedented, a faction that rejected the fundamental premises of all three powers. "You came to tell me I told you so," Kerrigan said without turning as Manhattan materialized behind her. She was observing a training exercise where Terran Marines worked alongside domesticated Zerglings. The sight should have been impossible. Zerg organisms were hive mind controlled, incapable of independent action. But Kerrigan had found a way to sever individual creatures from the Overmind's network and imprint them with basic behavioral conditioning. "I came to observe," Manhattan replied. "Your experiment here is unique. You're attempting to prove that the three-way conflict isn't inevitable, that cooperation between species is possible. More than attempting, succeeding. These Terrans chose to follow me. These Zerg were given choice for the first time in their existence. We're small now, but the principle matters. If I can demonstrate that there's a fourth option beyond Protoss purity, Zerg consumption, or Terran exploitation, maybe this sector can find a different path. And if you fail, if the Protoss decide your hybrid faction is an abomination that must be cleansed, if the Overmind deploys its full strength to reclaim the Zerg you've stolen, if Mengsk sends assassins to eliminate the threat you represent." Kerrigan finally turned to face him, her eyes burning with psionic energy that had become constant rather than intermittent. "Then I fail, but at least I tried. That's more than you can say, standing on the sidelines, observing everything, committing to nothing." The accusation stung because it was accurate. Manhattan had spent 6 months watching the sector's conflicts without truly participating. He'd defended himself when attacked, offered cryptic observations when asked, but never actually chosen a side or supported a vision for how things should be. He was the universe's most powerful bystander. "I don't know what I should commit to," Manhattan admitted. "In my universe, I tried to save humanity and failed. I tried to prevent nuclear war and only delayed it. I tried to maintain relationships and watch them dissolve as my perception of time made genuine connection impossible. Everything I've committed to has ultimately proven meaningless against the scale of cosmic entropy. So you gave up, fled to another universe, and decided to just watch instead of trying." "Yes." Kerrigan's expression softened slightly. "That's the difference between us. You've got godlike power and no idea how to use it. I've got limited power and absolute certainty about my purpose. I'm going to change this sector even if it kills me. Because the alternative, accepting that millions die in an endless war nobody can win, is worse than death." Manhattan observed the futures branching from this moment. Kerrigan's faction would grow, would attract others who rejected the binary choices the sector offered. The Protoss would eventually view her as threat worthy of military response. The Overmind would attempt to reintegrate her by force, and Mengsk would do everything possible to destroy what he'd inadvertently created. Her survival probability across the next decade was less than 30%. But in the futures where she survived, the sector changed fundamentally. Her hybrid faction became proof that alternatives existed, that evolution didn't require submission to the swarm, that purity of form wasn't the only path to strength. She became the catalyst for transformation that none of the three powers could provide alone. "You want me to help you," Manhattan said, finally understanding why she'd allowed him to find her base. "Not with direct power. You know I won't simply annihilate your enemies, but you want my presence as deterrent. As long as I'm observing your faction, the others will hesitate before attacking, uncertain what I might do." "I want you to choose," Kerrigan corrected. "Not which faction wins, but whether you believe anything in this sector matters enough to protect. You've spent 6 months claiming detachment while clearly being invested enough to remain. At some point, that contradiction has to resolve. Manhattan looked at the hybrid community she'd created, Terrans and Zerg working together toward shared survival, neither dominating nor being dominated. It was fragile, temporary, probably doomed to fail against the weight of 3 civilizations dedicated to mutual annihilation. But it was a genuine attempt at something better. Built by someone who'd been transformed against her will and chose to make that transformation mean something beyond victimhood. In his universe, John Osterman had become Dr. Manhattan and eventually fled Earth entirely because he couldn't find purpose worth his attention. But perhaps that had been the wrong question. Perhaps the point wasn't finding purpose worthy of godlike power, but finding purpose worth defending, despite knowing all the ways it might fail. "I'll remain nearby," Manhattan said finally. "I won't fight your battles for you. I won't guarantee your survival. But I'll observe with preference for your continued existence. If major powers move against you, they'll do so knowing I'm watching and may respond unpredictably." It wasn't commitment. It wasn't alliance. But it was more than detached observation. And Kerrigan recognized the significance. She nodded once, accepting the limited protection his ambiguous interest provided. "That'll have to be enough," she said. "Thank you, John." He hadn't been called by his original name in years. Hearing it from her lips reminded him of the human he'd been, the person who'd cared about discrete individuals and specific outcomes. That person was gone, transformed irreversibly by quantum dissolution and reconstitution. But perhaps some fragment of John Osterman's values persisted in Dr. Manhattan's consciousness, hidden beneath detachment and cosmic perspective. Manhattan teleported away without further words, returning to the void between stars where he could observe the sector's conflicts from appropriate distance. But he marked Kerrigan's location in his awareness, monitoring the probability cascade surrounding her faction. He told himself it was academic interest, studying how her hybrid model might influence the larger war. He knew that was a lie. He cared whether she succeeded, despite knowing she probably wouldn't. He wanted her fourth path to prove viable, even while perceiving the overwhelming odds against it. And that wanting, that preference for one outcome over others, meant he'd stopped being purely observational the moment he'd interfered with the Overmind on Char. The Koprulu sector had changed him as much as he'd changed it. He'd come seeking mathematical complexity and found something more dangerous. Purpose that might justify his existence even in the face of inevitable entropy. Across the sector, 3 civilizations continued their endless war. The Protoss pursued purity of form. The Zerg evolved toward purity of essence. The Terran struggled for survival through technological adaptation. And now a 4th faction emerged, too small to matter militarily, but large enough in principle to question everything the others assumed. Manhattan watched them all, no longer merely observing, but quietly hoping in ways that would have embarrassed the detached quantum god he'd claimed to be. Hoping that consciousness could choose better futures than biology or physics alone allowed. Hoping that someone like Kerrigan, transformed against her will but refusing victimhood, might prove that autonomy mattered more than design. In the quantum foam of possibility, futures branched and collapsed with each passing moment. Most led to familiar outcomes: Protoss victory, Zerg consumption, Terran extinction, or mutual annihilation. But a few timelines showed something different, something unprecedented. Those were the futures Manhattan decided to watch most carefully. Not to ensure they came to pass, he wasn't ready for that level of intervention yet. But to witness whether consciousness, given genuine choice, might create outcomes that surprised even an observer who experienced all time simultaneously. The war continued. The sector burned. And Dr. Manhattan remained, no longer entirely sure whether he was observing the conflict or becoming part of it. The Koprulu sector would never be the same after Dr. Manhattan's arrival. His brief interface with the Overmind had planted seeds of quantum-aware evolution that would take decades to fully manifest. His demonstration of power had forced all three factions to acknowledge limits to their ambitions. There were forces in the universe beyond their understanding or control, and his choice to orbit Kerrigan's growing hybrid faction, watching with something uncomfortably close to investment, had created a wild card that disrupted every strategic calculation. But the most significant change wasn't tactical or strategic, it was philosophical. The sector's inhabitants had confronted a being of absolute power and discovered he was as lost as they were, seeking purpose in a universe that offered none inherently. If even a quantum god struggled with meaning and connection, perhaps the answer wasn't power at all. Perhaps it was the choices made despite knowing all the ways they might fail. Sarah Kerrigan continued building her fourth path, knowing Manhattan watched with inexplicable interest. The Protoss executor studied reports of the blue entity's movements, wondering if isolation truly was worse than death. And deep in Char's volcanic core, the Overmind processed new evolutionary pathways, while contemplating what it meant that the most powerful being it had encountered was also the loneliest. Dr. Manhattan drifted through the void between stars, observing probability cascades that now included his own uncertain purposes. He had come seeking complexity and found something far more dangerous, beings whose struggles reminded him of questions he'd thought transcended. Questions about whether existence required connection, whether power demanded purpose, whether consciousness was curse or gift. The wars would continue. The Zerg would swarm, the Protoss would purge, the Terrans would endure. But they would do so knowing they were watched by something that had chosen to care, however reluctantly, about which futures came to pass. In the quantum uncertainty that defined his existence, Dr. Manhattan had found a strange new variable: hope. Not hope that he could save this sector. He'd learned better than to believe in salvation. But hope that somewhere in the chaos of consciousness, choosing its own path, meaning might emerge that even an observer who saw all timelines simultaneously couldn't predict. The Koprulu sector burned with war, evolved through conflict, and stumbled toward futures unknown. And for the first time since leaving his original universe, Dr. Manhattan felt something resembling purpose in watching what came next. May the Force be with you. More stories await.